The Trouble Doll. It was my Aunt Jackie that taught me to love AM radio. In the summertime, when school was out and on holidays, she would drive down from Trenton, Georgia, to Attala, Alabama, in that old baby blue Buick of hers. After an hour or so of my mother and Aunt Jackie's gossip, my daddy would throw my suitcase into the back seat and I'd climb into the car with her and we'd head up US 11 through Collinsville and Fort Payne to Valley Head, on past the little town of Hammondville and Sulphur Springs, crossing the Georgia line from Alabama into Trenton. It wasn't very long after we passed the square in Trenton that we'd turn off US 11 down a narrow dirt road, driving past hay fields and crossing a little creek. The deep shade of the overhanging trees opened into a clearing, and she'd parked that car right there under the trees beside the cabin where she lived with her 2 dogs. When I was at her house, I had my own room, which I didn't have the luxury of at home, where I shared my room with my 2 sisters and my parents had the other. But at Aunt Jackie's, I slept in a big double bed with a pink quilt and matching curtains in a room all my own. When I was with Aunt Jackie, I could sleep in late, paint my toenails bright red, eat chocolate cake any time I wanted because it was her favorite cake and there was always one in the cake dish. I could drink Coca-Colas, wear curlers in my hair all day long, and lounge out in the sun with a bikini on. I could do everything I wasn't allowed to do at home, and I loved every minute of it. Aunt Jackie was a writer for Mystery Romance magazine in Atlanta. She worked from home and made a weekly trip to the post office to mail in her submissions. She was a night owl, and in the evenings her kitchen became her office, and after our dinner she'd clear the kitchen table. Out would come the royal typewriter, her notepads, an ashtray, cigarettes, and a coaster for her coffee cup. She'd start the percolator and put a couple beers and a Coke on ice for when we were done. She'd turn on the little RCA radio that sat on the table. When the rest of the world was going to sleep, Aunt Jackie was just getting started. We'd settle into the kitchen with her dogs curled up on the braided rug beneath the table. She had stacks of notebooks on that table with white labels in bold writing on the cover of each one according to their topic. I was a murderess, or the odd case of the abandoned apartment. Aunt Jackie had a big imagination. She had a way with words and could weave a good tale. But some of her storylines came from listening to the radio, mainly the news. Now at home, Mama and Daddy would listen to the news after dinner each night when the dishes were washed and put away, or Fibber McGee and Molly and the baseball games that Daddy loved on big wax radio out of Gadsden. But that was about it. Listening to radio for them was cut and dried, and at home we never listened to faraway stations that crackled to life in the evenings. But Aunt Jackie taught me that the radio waves came to life after 9 p.m. with faraway stations crackling out of the static like ethereal voices from beyond. There were stations like KMOX out of St. Louis and WWL out of New Orleans and AM 770 all the way from Cincinnati, Ohio, with big band music and folks talking about odd places and things they never talked about on local radio stations we listened to at home. We'd talk for a while, and then she would write a few lines and listen some more way into the night. Aunt Jackie would listen to one thing or another for a while and make some notes, and then turn the dial to the next station, and we would do this most of the night. I knew about the weather in Chicago and bridge traffic in New York, a bank robbery in St. Paul, or when Mardi Gras was going on in New Orleans. I bet I knew more than most kids about our world. I heard generals talk to commentators about the Eastern Front of the war and was sitting right there at the table with Jackie when FDR said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Now, Aunt Jackie occasionally ordered things from the radio: a box set of hair curlers that didn't require hairpins, and some all-weather boots that were heated. She ordered a book about organizing your kitchen, and she even ordered me a knitting machine once, and I made a hat and scarf. But this one July night, it was raining, and the airwaves were fading and crackling. There was thunder and lightning off toward Lookout Mountain, and Jackie was just finishing up a chapter of her latest story, when suddenly an angry voice came through the static, and I could tell at once that it was a preacher. He was shouting and carrying on, gasping for breath every 2 or 3 words. "Does your neighbor offend you?" he asked, and went off into a chapter from the Old Testament that I had heard in Sunday school, and Jackie kept writing. The preacher said something that made her stop. "Then you need the Trouble Doll. Does that harlot keep chasing after your intended? Do you have a pesky neighbor or a ghost around your door? Then for the low, low price of $1, yes, friends, $1, you can have the Trouble Doll." Aunt Jackie stopped writing completely and looked at me, smiling. "Yes, she will come to your door in a plain brown box, complete with instructions, and your troubles will be gone. Just mail your dollar to me, the Reverend Jacob Laveau, at 666 Resolution Way, New Orleans, Louisiana. And I will send you the Trouble Doll, blessed by the sacred sisters of the Holy Order, and your troubles will be gone." "Well, that just beats all," Jackie said, looking at me. She snatched up a piece of paper and wrote down the address as I looked on. "What are you going to do?" I asked her, and she smiled. "Well, I'm going to order it, of course. Don't you think it would be fun? A real live voodoo doll from New Orleans?" And I had to think about that. The next day we drove over to Trenton, and she mailed off several envelopes to the magazine, and one to the Reverend Laveau. She let me address the envelope and stuffed the dollar inside and put the stamp on the letter and slid it into the out-of-town slot. It was the very first time I had ever sent a letter out of town. A couple of weeks passed, and we made our trip to the post office as usual, and there it was, a brown paper package from New Orleans. We stowed the package away in the trunk while we shopped for groceries and then hurried home. At the house, we unloaded the groceries and put them away. Aunt Jackie poured us a Coke, and then she handed me a butter knife. I cut into the cardboard and pulled the box open. There inside, nestled in a thick pile of moss and shredded paper, was the Trouble Doll. I glanced at Aunt Jackie and pulled it from its bed of moss and held it in my hand. The doll was about 10 inches tall. It was made of white muslin and stuffed with cotton. It had no facial features, no eyes, nor mouth, or hair, and as we examined it, we saw that it was perfectly hand-stitched in red thread. She took the doll into her hand, and I held the piece of paper. Aunt Jackie laid the doll down beside the box as I unfolded it. I sat looking at the paper for a moment as she crossed her legs and lit a cigarette. "Well, what does it say?" "Read it to me." I cleared my throat and began to read. "This is a blessed day for you, friend. The Trouble Doll has been blessed and sewn by the Sisters of the Holy Order, hand-stitched with cotton thread dyed red with the blood of the Holy Sisters, stuffed with herbs and cotton gathered by their hands, and blessed by the Honorable Reverend Laveau himself. The Trouble Doll has been made just for you. It is not to be used in jest or as a game. You must always keep the Trouble Doll on the bed of moss inside its box in a dark place. Use caution when you open the paper packet of pins. You will find 4 of them inside. One has a black head, and it must be used only to keep trouble away when it comes. The second has a green head, and it is for financial blessings. The third has a yellow head, and it is to drive away storms and danger. And the fourth has a red head. It is to be used only to do away with something or someone that is causing you harm. If for any reason you should not want the trouble doll or find that you are dissatisfied with it, you must follow these instructions carefully. You must not bury, burn, cut, give away, or attempt to destroy the trouble doll in any manner, as grave injury could result. You must return the trouble doll in the box with all its contents to the return address provided, or deliver the trouble doll in person to the Sisters of the Holy Order in New Orleans. We were both silent for a while. Aunt Jackie looked at me, and I looked at her, and she looked at the paper and folded it up and put it back into the box, along with the doll and the packet of pins. She laughed and tried to make light of the situation and said, "Well, I believe we've got ourselves a bona fide New Orleans Voodoo Doll." And I laughed, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I'd seen a movie once at a theater in Gadsden about the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, a movie about an evil voodoo queen who ran around the city casting spells on anyone or anything that made her angry and dancing wildly about a blazing fire with shrunken heads in it. Aunt Jackie could see that I was worried and swept up the box and its contents. "We'll put our voodoo doll in the cabinet out here in the hall," she said, and sat it up top amid several other boxes of things she had ordered, and we got on with our day. But I began to notice that every time the dogs went down the hall, they would steer clear of that cabinet and avoid it at all costs. And every time I passed the cabinet, coming or going from my room, I could swear I saw that box move. A few days passed, and one morning at breakfast, I could tell Aunt Jackie had something on her mind. She said, "I've never had so many odd little things to happen since we got that voodoo doll," and I had to agree with her. Just one morning last week, a strange little traveling salesman had appeared at the door, and when she told him she didn't want anything he was selling, he spat on the doorstep and got into his car and sped away. She noticed the car had Louisiana tags. And then her Buick just burst into flames one day at the grocery store for no good reason. The bag boy put out the fire in the carburetor with some baking soda, and the mechanic said he couldn't figure out why it happened. That same day, a packet of her stories that she had mailed to Atlanta got lost, and she had to retype them all for her publisher. And there were odd noises in and out of the house, and the dogs were upset by them all. One night, I had a dream about voodoo queens dancing around in the kitchen, and that same night, the dogs kept howling. Still, summer rolled lazily along. We swam in the creek and camped for a couple of nights and visited Mentone. We went to Sand Mountain to Shape Note singings and dinners on the ground. And it was a magical time with the crickets and the tree frogs singing and listening to the radio in the kitchen with Aunt Jackie. And we pretty much forgot about the trouble doll and didn't hear the Reverend Laveau anymore on the radio until that hot August night when the storms came in and I was coming out of the bathroom after a bubble bath in my bathrobe and new pink baby doll pajamas. I stopped in the hall to lean against the cabinet and pulled on my slippers when I heard a noise over my head, and the box that the trouble doll was in came crashing down to the floor, and there it was. I bent over to pick it up. I reached out my hand to grab it, when suddenly Aunt Jackie's old hound dog Abner came running out of somewhere and stood between me and the doll. He began to growl and bark, and Aunt Jackie came rushing from the kitchen and pulled him away. "Good Lord, Abner, what's gotten into you?" Aunt Jackie picked up the trouble doll and shoved it back into its box. She took my hand and led me into the kitchen, and we made a snack. It was about midnight when the storms came, and the airwaves on the radio were full of static, and the station we had been listening to began to fade. Aunt Jackie laid down her pen and paper. There was a low rumble of thunder down the valley, and then the lightning began, and the dogs ran to get under the bed. The lights began to flicker, and she lit an oil lamp just in case, and sure enough, the lights flashed a few times and went out. And there we were in the darkness, with the winds howling and blowing outside, whipping the trees around the house. And there we were, listening to the rumbling thunder and the wind. Then, that's when the strangest thing I've ever seen happened. Aunt Jackie's radio ran off electricity and had no batteries. As we were sitting there in the dark with only the oil lamp at the table, that radio came to life. The radio lights came on and the airwaves crackled, and there was the voice of the Reverend LeBeau, clear as day. "You have to use the trouble doll, praise the Lord, in the storms of life." We both jumped half off our chairs and grabbed each other as I let out a scream. Aunt Jackie stood up and shoved the RCA radio off the table into the floor, where it fell with a crash, and it was silent again. We looked at each other, too stunned to react, as a tree crashed to the ground nearby somewhere outside, and then the dogs began to howl. There was a thud in the hall, and Abner came out from under the bed barking and carrying on again. Aunt Jackie picked up the oil lamp and grabbed me by the hand. We went into the hall, and there was the trouble doll once again on the floor with Abner growling over it. I think at that point, Aunt Jackie began to be scared. She kicked the box across the hall into the open closet, and we huddled in the kitchen until the storm subsided. By that time, daylight was coming on, so she put on some coffee and cleaned up the remains of her radio. She went into the hall and picked up the box with the trouble doll inside from the closet floor. She got some tape from somewhere and taped that box shut with everything inside, and when it was good light, we drove into town. As soon as the post office was open, we went inside, and we mailed the trouble doll back where she had come from, back to the Big Easy, back to the Reverend LeBeau and the land of those voodoo queens. In the car, on the way home, we were silent until Aunt Jackie said, "Let's just keep this one to ourselves, okay, kid?" I promised her I wouldn't say another word about it. I was just glad that the trouble doll was out of our lives. I closed my eyes as we headed toward home and a good day's rest.